Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon, and today we have another very special guest, a returning guest. It's our old friend, one of the finest comedians in the land, and presenter of Headliners on GB News, Mr. Simon Evans.
Hiya, Nick. Hello. I apologise for not having my usual hairpiece in place this evening.
Yeah, you've changed. What happened to that?
That was the main subject of conversation in the comments under YouTube last time, wasn't it?
That's the problem with something like that. It will cause a distraction.
Yeah. No, it was worth an experiment, but until I can afford to go and get proper plugs put in, like our mutual colleague.
Yeah. We just want to focus on the content of your character, Simon, not the content
that's
of your
fair
head.
enough.
Have you been doing loads of tour shows and stuff?
I did last week. I was 5 days in a row. Yeah, Darlington, Hexham, Carlisle, Glasgow, and then Surrey, somewhere called Cranley. That was great. I would happily tour every night of the week for weeks on end, and then take a bit of time off. It's great once you get into the rhythm of it. Actually, I find it very agreeable, and the shows went very well. But now it's gone quiet again. I've got one this week in Market Drayton, which is much further away than it sounds like it has any right to be.
Yeah, I always think I might not have hated comedy so much if I was touring, because I do the live shows now for Weekly Skeptic. When it's your own audience, it is a massive difference, isn't it?
It's your own audience, and also I talk for 2 hours, so I can really cover anything I want to and sort of go on the full journey. Whereas the worst thing I always found with stand up, I still enjoy it, the club gigs. If they would pay good money, I would still do them, but. As a friend once said, if your style of comedy is that you're always simmering and rattling the lid of the pot, and threatening to blow it off, but never actually doing so, that can be very effective, a satisfying way of doing comedy. But if you follow somebody onto the stage who has just like kicked the pan off the stove and hoofed it around the room and already exploded all the ingredients. It's kind of already ruined. Do you know what I mean? If anyone you follow onto a stage like that, if you're trying to work a slightly different, just a slightly more teasing kind of form of comedy, then it's kind of difficult. So I prefer to have my own audience so I can control the tone and temperature of the whole evening.
Yeah, basically anyone who's had someone up on stage from the crowd before you, it's all over.
Yeah,
you can't follow that.
Yeah.
Any instrument, any antics. Just jumping about, anything that's just too physical, just no.
Or even just anyone using strong language endlessly and repeatedly until it becomes dulled, till the edge becomes dulled.
We all like Scott Shapiro, but there's no... Yeah, anyone that gets banned from a country just before you go on, like Scott for talking about Palestine.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And I didn't even think he had particularly strong views about that, of all the comedians that I would know. But anyway.
I'm not particularly sure he does. I think his strongest view is he wants to wind people up and annoy the audience. As soon as they say he can't, he's like, what am I doing? I'm just going to say it. What? And then it's going to get so much worse. What did I say? What? I just said they should all be blown up. What? And that's what he's like. How do you think this new hate crime law will affect you then? Because you're someone that actually likes the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. I hated it. You like it. But now we've got this new dystopian hate crime law Scotland are putting through. I think it's going through on April 1st just for extra banter, April Fool's Day. And this new law points out the material used for stirring up hatred could be communicated by playing a video through public performance of a play, which is very similar to a comedy show, online, on a sign, or through printed media. And even if you forward or repeat the material, you could be in trouble. And BBC had today, the Police Scotland have reassured us, they're saying it will not target performers with the new hate crime law. It will just they won't go looking for offending material, the police say, right? So they'll only respond to complaints. Well, isn't that reassuring? Because no one's ever put in a vexatious complaint because they're an ideological opponent. I mean, how is this going to affect? Would you boycott Edinburgh because of this?
Well, I wouldn't boycott it, although, to be honest, I don't have a show booked there this year anyway, but I'm still looking at the possibility of going up with something a bit different, maybe like sort of afternoon talks or lectures or something, but I'm not taking up a stand-up show. I was up there last year, and the tour show that I'm doing will continue to tour through both sides of Edinburgh, so it's not, crucial. But I can't imagine it's going to have anything but a profoundly chilling effect, and I think it's terrible. I think it's catastrophic because, exactly as you say, most of the cancellations that we've heard of over the last few years have usually come from actually temporary hospitality staff, front of house people, that sort of thing, ushers or whatever, who tend to be taken from the sort of student pool. It's very rare that a ticket-buying member of the public goes to see a show and is so profoundly disappointed or has misunderstood what the comedian is about that they're shocked. But people who work at the venues and they enact a terrible vengeance on their employers if they're not allowed to determine the Overton window of what can be discussed in the name of comedy. And obviously comedy is oversteps the mark. Obviously it transgresses. That's, people talk about comedy being edgy, and they don't mean it edgy like a knife. They mean, you work around the edge of what is and is not acceptable to say, because that's where everyone gets a little bit more excited, about the prospect of something transgressive happening. So if they're going to make people nervous that they could get you don't need to be sued, you don't need to be put into jail, even just having the merest suggestion that you had committed some sort of hate crime would be a terrible thing to be tarnished with early on in your career, which is what a lot of people at Edinburgh are. Horrible. It's terrible, absolutely horrible. And it's we've been saying for years, it's like incremental. Oh, this little change. Oh, that won't make any difference. Oh, that you'll hardly notice it. Well, the frog is really simmering now, in my view.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And by the way, the ushers thing is so funny. Like, what finally took down the West? Oh, it was the ushers? It's just so ridiculous that they were the ones to take down the liberal arts. Just some narky students who, why are they even there on, to get some extra pocket money in the summer, and then they destroy the liberal arts in the West. I mean, and the other thing that's funny is hate speech. What is a joke if not hate speech with a bit of misdirection and hopefully a laugh at the end? That's half of my jokes when I did comedy.
Yeah, absolutely. And over the course of an hour, hopefully it balances out and you do a bit of self-deprecation. And, people always used to say, well, you can be an offensive comedian, but everyone gets it in the neck sooner or later. But they're all the famous stories of, I think there was a woman in the front row of a Frankie Boyle concert years ago who laughed along merrily at every, horrifically offensive and sick joke until it hit the one thing that she was personally connected to. I think having a son in a wheelchair or something. And suddenly she's like, oh, no, that's too far, that's too much. It's like, well, you've already negated your right to speak out. But, I mean, the whole kind of... I think there is some truth. I don't say it's like an organised thing, but there is some truth, some understanding to the fact that people have realised that as soon as you can get into any kind of organisation now, you do not have to achieve any degree of what would previously have been regarded as seniority in order to start having an impact on its culture. And I think that's a really dangerous and serious change, because it just means that anyone with that kind of temperament, that kind of attitude, that kind of corrosive, destructive inclination to tear down that, Scruton talks about in his awakening in '68 in Paris, it's the work of a moment to tear down things that took decades to build up.
Yeah, that's true. So easy to destroy, much harder to create. And you probably saw the hate monster as well, which I actually watched the video. I hadn't watched the video before. It's just like it's a hate monster, which is this guy who's there. He's the new face of he's the public face of the new hate crime law. It looks
he's
like
Elmo,
monster.
Isn't he, or something? Yeah.
Bit of Cookie Monster, a bit of Elmo, and they give him this Glaswegian accent. If you're a bit Dune, you'd probably be hating people, and it even says like people that don't look like you. And it basically it's this like thick Scottish accent saying, probably you go out, you've had your chips or whatever. Basically, like it paints the picture of clearly a working class Scottish white man.
Yeah. Well, it also literally it specifically says that, though, at some point, doesn't it? That this is mostly white men. Yeah.
That was the outrageous part of the text.
Do you know Ewan Morrison? He's on Twitter. He's an author. He's a novelist in Scotland and a very smart guy. He curates a brilliant Twitter account with digs out sort of great old clips of early 20s vampire films or Gustave Doré illustrations to the Divine Comedy, a wide range of interesting things. Okay. But one of his things is that he wrote quite a long blog post that was very interesting, maybe 18 months ago, about twee authoritarianism, about the tactic by which you mask an authoritarian instinct by presenting it in a twee, childlike, infantilized kind of aesthetic. And that's, as he says, this hate monster is a perfect example of this. Right. Where you go, oh, that can't be fascism. Look, it's a cuddly toy.
Yeah. I was saying to Toby yesterday, imagine like the meetings and the amount of rounds that had to go through. And like, what if we make it hate white men? Yeah, okay. What range? Oh, let's say 18 to 30. So the actual language says, why do some people let the hate monster in? We know that young men aged 18 to 30 are most likely to commit hate crime, particularly those from socially excluded communities who are heavily influenced by their peers, poor white men. they maybe have deep-rooted feelings of being socially and economically disadvantaged, probably because they are, combined with ideas about white male entitlement. So somehow they've never had anything, but they think they deserve everything. Does that paint the picture of the average working-class Scottish guy? To me, he's just a bloke that's probably never had anything, he's trying not to do heroin, trying to just get by in Scotland. Now the hate monster comes along, tells him he's inherently evil, does him for a hate crime for having a laugh with his mates on a Friday night, and just beating up a couple of English people. I mean, that was always the permitted hate in Scotland. I wonder if that's covered by the hate monster, but it's okay if they're English. Yeah,
you're right, though. I mean, in that first half, they seem to be talking generally and perhaps even legitimately about, that is peak testosterone, 17 to 25, 17 to 30. Young men are more likely to commit crimes. If you can keep them out of jail until that time, they generally never offend seriously afterwards. But at that point, you're kind of going socially excluded. Oh, this might mean, recent immigrants to the country who've failed to kind of get a toehold or whatever. It's all open. It's all up for debate. By the end, they're quite obviously, specifically just saying, you white blokes, which is, and also, of course, in Scotland, which is a very much less diverse community than London, ethnically diverse. They're pretty much, most of the hatred historically in Scotland has been sectarianism within the Christian church, right?
Right.
And hatred of the English, but then those two map onto each other anyway. So, this kind of idea that there's some kind of, far-right militia emerging in Scotland is just, God, it's so insulting apart from anything else, isn't it?
Yes. And one wonders if it's tied to the fact that Humza Yousaf seems to not be the biggest fan of white people. We had that famous speech where he's saying, we list all these jobs that are taken up by white. Someone did a mashup of it. I saw today with just all the whites next to each other, and it's just vicious and weird. And but the actual speech, you don't need to do much editing. The original speech is incredibly weird, and I wonder how it all ties together with this. I mean, you can start to sound whatever, but you've got this thing where every leader now is non-white, and this is being celebrated by that guy. People like that guy Nazir Afzal, who was openly celebrating this. They're all non-white, and he said representation matters, and it's like, well, where's our representation? So Sunak's been parachuted in, wasn't voted for. Humza Yousaf not voted for, took over from Nicola Sturgeon. Vaughan Getting voted for by the Labour members, not anyone else. The Northern Ireland woman not voted for. And you just think, I don't know, you just think, what's going on here? What's it all about?
It would be quite something if somebody were to stand up like Yousaf and say, Prime Minister of England, Brown. First Minister of Scotland, Brown. First Minister of Ireland, Brown. I mean, imagine that. I mean, that would be literally I would regard that as inflammatory.
Yeah. And you wonder how they're going to get around that. But there was that article the other day, the people of colour in the Tories tend to pull the ladder up. So they're going to be like, okay, they're all represented by non-white people at the top, but they've pulled the ladder up, so other ones can't get there. Which might be true, but then that's class then again, isn't it? Then we're back to class. Then we're back to, you've just picked a few posh people which is always a problem in comedy. It was like, let's be representative, but let's have a few ultra-privileged non-white people, which didn't do anything.
It depends what they mean by the ladder, doesn't it? If by the ladder you mean, you could say people who went to grammar school got into government and shut down the grammar schools. That's what I would call pulling the ladder up. I think that was a bad decision on balance, but it was certainly a ladder. It was a ladder which was lowered into working class communities and no longer exists there.
Yeah,
there's no particular ladder by which, I don't know, who the Kemi Badenoch has climbed some sort of. She didn't climb an affirmative action ladder in order to get into the Tory party, as far as I know.
Someone's been emailing me claiming she did, and that she was part of the kind of A-list generation, and she is a diversity hire. I mean, she's clearly very smart. Toby's a big fan of her, but some people do mess with her and say, no, Kemi's the same. So we don't. But of course, that's the problem, isn't it? Once you have that, everyone always goes, is that a diversity hire or merit? And we can never know now. And that's very annoying for the people involved as well, because one presumes Kemi would get there anyway. She's very, very smart. But
people do sometimes. I remember Charles Murray saying that, when he was challenged by Sam Harris, why do you care about scholastic standards being maintained or whatever? Why does it matter to you that Harvard shouldn't lower its SAT test, entry level for African Americans or whatever? And he said, because I feel bad for those people, because they will never enjoy the confidence of any rank, any achievement they have. It will be presumed that they have been smuggled in through the back door. And there's some truth to it, but I also think it's disingenuous. I don't think that's the only reason he cares. I think he cares because he thinks status should accord with achievement. It should be it's a self.
Yeah, that's the main point, isn't it? That's like the secondary point. The other thing he said, they're both relevant. We want merit, and then also it's not good for them either. But although merit,
but it's a bit like being a Republican just because you think it's cruel, or that somebody like Prince William grows up in the public eye and has no opportunity to lead a normal life. Well, that is an argument for republicanism, but it's not. I'm not a Republican myself, but I think it's disingenuous to say that's the argument.
Right, and that reminds me. I was just talking on my last show of the last episode of the Current Thing with Reverend Dr. Jamie Franklin about meritocracy versus aristocracy. That strikes me as something you might have an opinion on, because the meritocracy, someone was replying to me on X, I said this last week, where they were saying, oh, why can't we just go back to treating everyone the same? And but what I tend to think now in my layman analysis is that what we thought was meritocracy was just our particular country, our particular tradition. It worked for a time, but it's not. It's by no means universal. Other cultures don't care about it. The left certainly don't care about it. They're actively against it. They want equity, so-called. And then Jamie was making the case that actually, do we even want meritocracy, though? One argument is the liberal thing. Let's get back to meritocracy, back to the 90s, as Academic Agent calls it, back to Fresh Prince. But the other argument is, let's not bother with any of this anyway. Let's go straight to aristocracy. Or, we could never get back to the aristocracy because they're gone. And Churchill was, in a way, they're kind of the last one in a sense. But would you be someone in your, because you do a lot of reading of obscure kind of writers and stuff, would you ideally want a meritocracy or an aristocracy or something more like that?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, as you say, there are at least two different questions there. One is, where do we go from here? What changes could be made in order to improve British society? And also, you could look back over 2,500 years since Pericles and Athens or whatever, and say, well, what were the best systems? What were the best communities? And what are possibly some of the aspects of those societies that are not so quickly discussed, such as the amount of slavery or the suppression of female talent or whatever within any of them. You probably know this, but meritocracy was a term coined by Toby Young's father. Did you know that?
I do remember that now you say it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, of course Toby's going to like it.
And he was a socialist philosopher, I think, and educationalist and so on. He intended it as a warning, because he said that in a meritocracy, you will soon quickly have just the same again. You will have an elite tier of people who control and run everything, but because they feel they've been elected, they've achieved their status and their autocratic control through their talents, through their innate abilities, they will feel much less of the nagging suspicion that they should be sort of kind and tolerant and giving and charitable and so on, that is characterized by the expression noblesse oblige, regardless of how much that may or may not have manifested from one person to the next. The aristocracy, in the sense that means inherited wealth and power, because the word literally just means government by the best. Aristo just means the best people run the place. But obviously, it does become very quickly property rights combined with power tend to mean that it becomes an inherited class of government. But they are they were mollified and muted to some extent by tradition and by also, I think, a certain kind of mellowness, perhaps, in some situations that defined that kind of rule, because things were settled and everyone could just relax. Whereas in a meritocracy, that's why you get sharp-elbowed parents, like inches away from physical violence, as they try and ensure their child has the best chance of getting onto the team and getting into the baiting society and so on. The kind of naked ambition of people who think they have a chance of succeeding in that society is arguably rather ugly, apart from anything else. And just there's a certain kind of shrill quality that emerges in that tier of society, which, it's not a slam dunk argument against it, but it's certainly a price we pay for that kind of thing. And also, as he said, it is every bit as inherited as heritable, because the unfortunate reality is that in a meritocracy, quite quickly, people, what do they call it? Mate select. They two intelligent, ambitious people with all the merits that a meritocracy rewards will select one another and have children with them, or maybe a child now, and that child will benefit from their genetic inheritance and their education and so on, every bit as much as they would have done from inheriting some drafty old stately home in the middle of Buckinghamshire. So you've kind of got a system that's no more egalitarian than the previous one, especially, as I say, now you no longer have grammar schools or any really very plausible ladder up if you happen to be born into poverty with a sharp mind.
Yeah, and that makes me think I probably never even experienced the meritocracy, because the grammar schools has always been the thing I'm most annoyed about. I was listening to Hitchens again the other day talking to Erin Bastani. I think you watched it as well. And I always get so angry about that. And I've done a whole video on this for Lotus Eaters about Hitchens and education and his views. I mean, his claims even that not only were the grammar schools far superior, but even the secondary moderns were superior to the comps. And I'm just forever bitter. Hopefully we didn't talk about last time, but my dad got to go to a grammar, came from a poor background. Parents worked in factories. My granddad drove a van, was in the army at 16, drove a van after. My dad got to get out of that through the grammar school. Then you go backwards, because I'm a comprehensive. Grammar schools are defunct. There I am, third highest grade in the country at history A level. I'll never talk about it. And high grades. No one ever says go to a good university. And the school itself, to even get those grades, the school was just, it's just football and fighting. Anything else is frowned upon. Academic achievement, you don't get out a book that's not on the syllabus ever, all that kind of thing. So I always imagine, what if I could have gone to the grammar schools? And it's one of those things, much like the aristocracy, it's gone. So you had the aristocracy that's gone, but then also the meritocracy of the grammar schools is gone. And what you've got now, as you say, with the pointy elbow people, is not that, it's the postcode lottery. So it's really back to a wealth-based system, which is a new kind of...
lie about their faith in order to get their kids into a good school, or move to a catchment area around a grammar school. And to be fair, it's still hard to game a stupid child into a grammar school. But if you can work the edges a little bit, marginal gains.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I've talked to you about this before, but I went to a school that had been a grammar school until 2 years before. I was the second year of intake. Of comprehensive intake. It remained an all-boys school, and it remained, the staff when I joined was still largely there from the grammar school days. So we had enough of it was almost a microcosm for modern Britain in a way. There was enough, just about. We were running on momentum and fumes to some extent, but it was enough to get me through. And I think I had a pretty good schooling as state schools go, got good grades, went to university. But you always have a feeling of what if my potential could have been recognised, and you can drive yourself insane by that. I can't complain. I had plenty of chances, but I do think that there is increasing entrenchment now, But on top of that, which is the more uncomfortable conversation, it is a statistically proven reality, and certainly the statistics in America are very clear on this, that the white Protestant, previous ethnic majority, within Britain, are actually the least ethnic in-group biased of any ethnicity. They not just in England, but just generally, white liberals just do not protect their own, and not even neutral. They tend to be actively hostile, not to their own family possibly, but to outside. And this, as you say, is the way of the world, and we accept it as if it's like the normal standard way of being, but it's not. There are many, many countries in the world, many traditions, where it's perfectly normal, and indeed you would be despised by your fellow. You would think, what were you doing? You had the opportunity there to advance your people, your friends, your extended family, your tribe, whatever you want to call it, and so it's a recipe for disaster. Arguably, that there's a sort of a lack of an immune system.
That is really strange, and that's one of the big coming themes, isn't it? Which we can't avoid. Which, like you say, it's a strange trait of this group. We see it in America with the fact that Latino voters are moving over to Trump, Black voters are even moving over to Trump, but the white libs still won't vote Trump. They're going to be the group voting Biden. It's going to be white libs and illegal immigrants. It's such a weird combination of people.
Well, the defining demographic that tilted the midterms and would do it again is unmarried white women.
White women, yeah.
And in that regard, although I understand it was bad law and you can see why it was struck down, but the Roe v. Wade decision was a catastrophe. They should have just left that as it was, because they shot themselves in the foot so badly with that. However much you may or may not feel personally about abortion as a political strategy. That was absolutely ridiculous, just stupid.
Well, I see what you mean. Yeah, because Trump, I'm always claiming, is basically a liberal centrist, which I think he is. But because he brought the Supreme Court justices in and managed to win the court, it's not packing the court. He managed to sort of win the Supreme Court battle by getting his people in, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, all these people who were rebelled against so hard by the left, Clarence Thomas and everything. Yeah, they put that through, and then I believe that's how it happened. And then
it infuriated it activated a democratic element that might conceivably have not otherwise voted. Because that's the thing. I mean, that's pretty much 101. The point about politics is to activate your base, right? Get your base out on election day. There's very few people who really change their minds dramatically, especially in a bipolar system like America's. In this country, you might get people who switch from Conservative to Reform, or possibly to SDP, or conceivably even, there may have been some who went from Tory to New Labour in '97. But mainly it's a question of how motivated do you feel to come out and support your side on election day. That's how things are decided, I think.
Well, I'm sure a lot of our listeners who are very pro-life, some of them would say, I mean, as am I, would say it was worth it, especially as they may have lost the midterms, but Trump's still going to win the election if it's fair, and therefore maybe it was worth it. But I see what your argument. Realpolitik,
if he does win, then I would totally hold my hands up and go, yeah, long term, long game, whatever. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, maybe. It didn't seem to activate. It didn't seem to motivate enough of Trump's base that he went, yes, see, I've done this for you, and we are now going to enact the social reforms that you've been waiting for.
It probably won over the Shapiro class of the sort of neocon orthodox people, but yeah, not that many of them. So yes, I see your point from a pragmatic angle. The other group, I mean, you said white women. A graph I saw the other day was basically everyone's voting Republican, men Republican, women Republican who are married to a lesser extent, unmarried women. I can't remember if it said they were white.
Yeah,
left.
So far, absolutely.
It's insane. But the other way to tackle that, of course, is that, change the voting laws. But we want to get into that. I mean,
property owning classes, yeah.
Well,
famously, the founding fathers.
Why not?
Founding fathers had, and I have no sort of religious adherence to the founding fathers thing. I always find it slightly amusing how much the Americans cleave to the original vision of them. But they made it quite clear that it was a Christian republic. That was first part, and arguably, of course, a lot of the southern border immigration, legal and illegal, that they're getting at the moment is more Christian in a way, of a certain kind of Christianity than the white liberal Democrat,
right.
The elite are. But anyway, they're more conservative than they were expecting in that regard,
Yeah,
it's a constitution that was drawn up for a Christian republic, and it was essentially, very similar to Britain in the pre-20th century, property owning, one vote per household, essentially, of those who own property. Now, that's, of course, that would just strike some people as like antediluvian and ludicrously regressive attitude, but it certainly wasn't as stupid and prejudicial and thick-headed as you might, as it would sound to try and reverse into that situation now, because people who had who were invested, who had some kind of stake in the future of the country, rather than just, wanting to break open the storeroom and hand around the sweeties.
Yeah, I was thinking, I heard an argument that you can't get rid of the vote now for anyone because, they won't accept it. They've got the right. So just add votes for people. So men could get on 100 maybe, if they own property, 1,000, just get 100 votes and do it like that. One of my little ideas. Well, it's not my idea. I heard someone say it.
That, I mean, obviously, that's a satirical angle on it, but that has happened to a large extent in America in the sense that the corporate world have vastly more control over the, through lobbying. Lobbying is a vastly more powerful tool for steering policy than any democratic machinery can compete with. Even, right. I don't know if you know Jesse Norman. He was until recently a sort of finance minister under Sunak's and Johnson's government. Very smart guy. He's written a very good biography of Adam Smith, and he would regard himself as a Burkean strokes Adam Smith sort of economist and politician. And he points out, that American politics now has drifted so far from Smith's vision of essentially, the free market, the invisible hand, is not a charter for crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is as much a toxic, a corrosive element in that system as socialism is. Dominic Frisby's very good on this as well.
Yeah, people talk now about left-wing capitalism. Like people thought you couldn't have such a thing, but that's kind of like what we have now. There's a kind of idea that could never happen. But anyway, that's out of my depth at getting into economics because it's my weakest point. I do agree about the one vote per household. I was shouted at a recent FSU event about this, but one vote per household, perfectly good idea. Otherwise, you pit the woman against the man as a political entity. Obviously, a terrible idea. Obviously, a source of conflict. So why not have one vote? Perfectly reasonable. That means if you were a single woman in a house, you would have a vote, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. You can argue back or forth, but I think a lot of people now, young people probably cannot quite believe, that the level of they would think of it as simply evil. The idea that that men had the vote or property only men. It just seems like a horrible dog in a manger attitude. But yes, it can create a more balanced society.
I've just realized the flaw with that is it doesn't I've just said single women are the ones that vote against Trump, left, so they would get a vote, and then you halve if it was the man and woman, and the married women are voting Republican, you'd halve their votes. Actually, that's not a good idea for me, is it? So we'd have to say no single women could vote.
Well, if you were to have that situation and it included households owned just by single women, yes, I mean, on the face of it, you empower them as against the married women who entrench their husbands' votes. But I suspect if you did that within households, you would find that a lot of the incentive structures for voting in different ways also changed anyway.
Yeah, I suppose the whole culture would start to change. In my vision, I heard as well that the suffragettes. There was the suffragettes and the suffragists, and the violent suffragettes were the violent ones who at the time were very unpopular. And actually, I heard an argument that a lot of the women at that time they wanted the vote just because they were bourgeois women who I mean, I've got this from Jonathan Bowden, basically. There was bourgeois women who wanted the vote just to sort of for keeping up appearances and standards. And that's all they really were worried about. They didn't really want all the other advances, and they didn't like the violence and so on. It's just that they weren't exactly feminists. They were just sort of, okay, well, it's kind of awkward not to have the vote. It makes us feel awkward in social settings and like we're lesser. But they didn't want the radicalism of the rest of feminism, which, at least the suffragette people went on to be fascist, didn't they? They were extremely pro-war. They were shaming men that weren't at war, and they were a dodgy bunch of suffragettes. Everyone thinks they were great because they weren't. And I don't know. I just think about that stuff more and more. What was it all about? And he points out, obviously a controversial figure, but a great speaker. He points out that that this was really an elite of women for feminism. Perhaps this point is not so original, but it was an elite of women. It suited them to put all these feminist reforms in, but for the average woman, it made life much worse. But it was just for a certain elite of women who were smart and capable and could do all these jobs. But actually, for most women, they didn't like it.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's certainly an intelligent and important part of the argument. I think class, funny enough, we were talking about this last night in Headliners, class, obviously I'm not a Marxist, but to the extent that I have any sympathy for that kind of analysis of society, it's extraordinary about the number of different ways of stratifying society that have been introduced to the detriment of a class analysis. Marxist class analysis remains the best way of doing that if you're going to do it at all. Social economic class remains the defining mechanism by which some people have more opportunity and some people have more privilege and so on. And you're absolutely right. The those suffragettes, kind of Mitford tendency, women who like to walk around dressed as men, smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, just felt excluded from that conversation because they were bright, they were articulate and ambitious, and they wanted to flex their muscles. And I totally get that, but it wasn't. I mean, John Stuart Mill was a considerably more profound feminist than any of the suffragists in his vision of how women entering Parliament and so on would be detrimental towards moving towards a stage where he would no longer discover the corpses of babies stuffed in bushes, where unmarried mothers had deposed of them. These are the kind of social ills that he was trying to counteract at the time. On liberty remains a much more valuable text, I think, in terms of understanding how one might have improved society from, the torrid post-industrial wreckage, huge upheavals in society that have been created by that. And I'm not surprised lots of different lots of different arguments were emerging about how to cope with it. But the 1920s, absolute convulsions across Europe, and an awful lot of the decisions made by Western democracies, as we understand them, were them attempting to let just enough steam out to prevent revolution. They were terrified of a Bolshevik revolution. Keynes is quite clear on this in a lot of his tracts. He's really worth reading if you want to understand what was going on at that time. They were all perfectly well aware that economic forces were going to ultimately they were going to be forced to introduce universal suffrage. It was just a question of introducing it gradually enough that that society could adapt to it. But the First World War was the decisive factor, rather than the some posh woman throwing herself under the king's horse.
Oh yeah, definitely the war, and especially for men as well. Once hundreds of thousands have died, and you say, well, you don't have the vote. Yeah, that won them the vote because they had to do something. So it's really the elite losing control via the First World War was a big thing to me. But then people say, no, the end of the aristocratic elite goes back even before then. But to me, the First World War certainly finished it off. It was an argument. Though I haven't read all those books, I need to read all those. I always feel bad I haven't read enough theory. I spent my youth reading novels for some reason, because I did literature, I guess. I used to read like 100 a year, and now I don't know anything about politics. And like you and Carl, despite what Otto English says, Carl has read a lot of books.
I think Carl. I get the sense that Carl has mellowed and I don't know, fleshed himself out quite a lot in the last few years. He used to come across quite didactic, or is that the word, or dogmatic, whatever. Anyway, I get the feeling he's quite a well-rounded and well-read individual now. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with reading fiction. I went through a phase. I probably haven't read as much as you anyway, but I went through a phase about 10 or 15 years ago reading a lot of those kind of smart thinking books, thinking fast and slow and that kind of stuff. And gradually I realized, partly because of the replication crisis, in psychological experiments that proved not to replicate on their, when they were re-examined and so on, that actually you can learn as much about human nature and society from reading not just Dostoevsky, but half a dozen decent, serious novelists, and their grasp of human nature will equip you and furnish your brain with an understanding of humans. But obviously, also, it's great to read Keynes. He's a great writer as well. He is a very, very gifted and actually quite artistically well-informed man and so on. But also, the world has changed dramatically. Certain things that they had, certain assumptions they had, that everyone had, until about 20 years ago, are being swept away by mass migration and technology and various other factors that whether or not climate crisis is real, it's certainly informing our political conversations to an extraordinary extent that was just not, there was no sense of environmentalism as being of any consequence, and the amount of self-harm inflicted by Western nations now in the name of climate crisis management and responsibility of that regard, just that calculation did not exist at all prior to, I don't know, Tony Blair.
Yeah, I know that's probably the central insanity. We talk about woke a lot, but the climate thing, I don't talk about it that much because it's so, you have to know science to refute it, and I can't be bothered. My take is just, it's bollocks, and that's it. But I'm not going to learn loads of science to try and refute it, and I'm so out of my depth with that. That's why I haven't had Ben Pyle on, even though people keep asking me to, and he seems brilliant, but I should get him on, but I should ask him, but I just can't be bothered because it's just climate. It's just so boring. I just get bored immediately. It's just not, my brain can't take it in. But I can look at the human side of it and the nihilism of it and the genocidal impulse behind some of it, where they say there's too many people, but I'm not going to go. I want all you lot to disappear.
Exactly. And old people say that. People in their 80s and 90s will say it's overpopulation is the problem. You're like, oh, well, which sector of society do you think is the problem?
Yeah.
I mean,
And where are they going to go?
I'm not going to, do anything. But when I saw how that virus was sweeping through, and how the demographics were affected, I was like, this could be the most benevolent thing to occur to the world since.
You say that. Do you know what I'm worried? Do you know what someone said to me the other day is that Starmer will start offering people. So I talked about it with Jamie already, but he's talking about legalizing so-called assisted dying, aka euthanasia. So terrifying to me because in Canada, they've killed, it was 13,500 people in 2022, I believe it was. And the amount of people they're killing in Canada is unbelievable. One of them this was in Michael Deacon's article in the Telegraph. One of them was a 41-year-old woman with fibromyalgia. That's what she said. But she told her friends privately she was just poor. So she just wanted to die. And they offed her because she was poor. Imagine that brought in with the Labour government here when you've got also what the useless eaters, as someone put it to me. Starmer could just start, going, hey, it's not that Starmer will be going around offering them, but they'll be giving you a leaflet. Sure you don't want to die? Can't pay your fuel bills this winter, could always die. Just have a read a leaflet. Don't decide now. That's coming to Britain.
Absolutely. And you don't have to go as far as Canada. I believe the Netherlands has experimented with it as well.
Netherlands.
I mean, I do think we're going to have some extraordinarily difficult conversations about assisted dying and so on. I don't have any strong dogmatic views either way about it, because I don't think it's acceptable that people should be expected to live with chronic pain for years when their life has become utterly meaningless and devoid of any pleasure or hope. But equally, the slippery slope is never more obviously in evidence, as you say. It doesn't even take very long. And also, of course, we know from having, and again, this is where both fiction and history and anything else you want to read will tell you, people adapt horribly quickly to things that strike most of us as monstrous initially, but they will come around to thinking, well, I guess that's that does sort of make sense. Yeah,
they will very quickly. And what's annoying to me is it'll be the same people that say, "Oh, we shouldn't have the death penalty." Okay, so we shouldn't have the death penalty for murder, someone who's murdered a child, but we should have death just for someone who's got fibromyalgia and is a bit poor. I mean, this is where we're going to go with it. So I say I'm pro death penalty, anti-euthanasia, which is the only ethical position, by the way, luckily, and it's my position. But you've got the slippery slope argument, which I think is the most compelling to use on the normie. But you also got the ethical argument. What does it say about a person if they're just, it's such a materialist, secular thing, isn't it? You're just a unit of, you're just a material bit of cells we can kill. But of course, in a Christian perspective, you can't do that. And I go back to the Old Testament. We talked about this with Jamie, with Noah, where it says, if you spill a man's blood, in your blood shall be spilled. So life was so sacred that if you murdered someone, the paradox is you should be killed via essentially a death penalty because you took life, which is the most sacred thing. Some people struggle with that paradox, but I believe in that. And also, you said people whose lives is devoid of pleasure and hope. Well, that's my life, but you can't euthanize me. So I mean,
your face says otherwise. I know what you mean. It's interesting that the Christian thing. I'm not a Christian, but I do think we have perhaps underestimated the checks and balances that Christianity put in place in society, even if people were paying lip service to it. Chesterton was very good on that, of course, as you probably read him. Would you consider
paganism? I'm considering it sometimes. Jamie made a strong case for Christianity to me, but I was listening to Bowden talk about paganism, and I was like, yeah, I've got my Viking heritage. I've got maybe start worshipping Odin and the sun. And it's a much more muscular religion than Christianity is these days.
I like the sun. I like the idea of worshipping the sun because that feels like the most natural thing to worship, certainly, But on the other hand, living in Britain, you feel like you're living in hell in that regard.
Right.
You've
also,
been denied access to the sun.
So
yeah,
I have a complex relationship with the sun.
I don't think paganism. I like the old stories. I like, I like reading the Hindu stories, and in common with some of our most eminent right-wing politicians, I regard the great Hindu literature as among the world's great treasures. But equally, I think you have to recognise that you cannot just adopt these things. Certainly not at the age of 58, in my view. In all honesty. You start from where you are. It's a bit, so many things in these kind of conversations have that old joke, well, I wouldn't start from here, and that's where I am now. I don't think it makes sense. Paganism really just means local village religion, doesn't it? It was a term, used in the Roman Empire to describe, to mean heathen, really, essentially. And so it doesn't really mean anything, I'm obviously not going to take on the Norse gods or something. I can read stories about them and understand how they might have reflected an ethos that was prevalent, but it doesn't mean anything now. I think, if anything, I would probably move more towards a kind of combination of, I suppose, almost like a stoicism informed by a degree of the insights gained from meditation and so on. I think that, there is a degree of, I think there's something, I haven't got into it deeply enough, but the most interesting things that I've heard people speak about and that make some sort of sense of the world to me are now the kind of the current idealism, analytical idealism, the idea that consciousness actually is what contains the universe, and that just kind of takes a lot of the pressure off you to kind of formulate something with huge amounts of detail and gods and edicts and stone tablets and so on. That doesn't really it doesn't connect, it doesn't grasp, it doesn't make purchase on me.
Where's that come? Because it sounded like a second ago you were promoting New Age Stoicism of some sort, meditation mixed with Stoicism. But where does this come from? This analytic idealism? Is that what you?
Well, there's a guy called Bernardo Kostrup, I think his name is, who speaks very intelligently and interesting about it. He's a PhD in philosophy and in computer science, and he kind of puts the two together. It's almost like the simulation hypothesis. The idea that this is all, none of this is real, which of course in itself is quite similar to Plato, which informed Christianity once it reached the West. So these things they're not like brand new crazy ideas. Christianity essentially is like a simulation hypothesis insofar as he says, or the Bible in total says, this is all a dream that precedes the reality that your actions in this world will dictate where you end up, perhaps. But there is a kind of, I don't want to go full stoicism becomes a sort of a horribly passive, arguably, and I also have some kind of sympathy with that Nietzschean idea that only in action are we truly ourselves. That sitting there, thinking about things is the worst thing. Your mind is not your friend. I do believe in that as well. So it's not about kind of just maybe this, maybe that, but there is there's a delusion that you need to destroy, which is that, it's anything more than an ego trip when you try and work out all the detail about what a proper society should look like. You have to just take command and control of your own sphere of influence, and that really is quite small.
Clean your bloody room is almost what you're saying. Yeah, that's what Peterson meant. Yeah, there's so many things there, but I just want to. Well, one thing is you're probably Gen X, right? I put you around.
I'm on the Boomer Gen X cusp, yeah.
Right. So some people say it starts 66 Gen X. I put you just in it, but based on what you've just said, but which would mean you're going to have that cynical attitude. I'm at the very end of Gen X. I'm technically just millennial, so I'm technically millennial, but grew up in Cumbria, as I say, at the very start of millennial. You're probably Gen X because you're behind anyway. And so I've very much had a Gen X mentality, which is probably where we meet. But the thing is, that does give you that cynical, detached mentality, that ironic mentality we all have. We didn't grow up with the sincerity of Christianity and so on, even though it was still present. So it is hard to come out of that entirely. This is what annoys me. I think I said it to Academic Age. What annoys me is people always assuming me like, oh yeah, well, I'm not religious, so I couldn't be Christian like you. I'm just trying to be. I'm not like, well, I don't even know if I can do it. I'm not one of these people. I'm not one of these, guys just handing out leaflets with a glazed-eyed expression. I'm just a cynical Gen X person myself, just thinking, well, what can we do? And the other thing you said there is this thing about adopting things. I do think that just because I sit around one day and say I'm a pagan now, what does that mean? It's ludicrous. So probably why I've gone back to Christianity is because is just simply my background is Protestant, English person from the north, and that was what we grew up in. And of course, it's the most tepid Church of England Christianity, although even that seems quite romantic now. But
we're both friends with Paul Tonkinson, who I think was interesting. I used to talk to Paul quite a lot about the Tao. He introduced me to Alan Watts, who's a great speaker and always, worth spending half an hour with. You always feel more relaxed after listening to him, just as a lovely sort of delivery. And he was one of the popularizers of sort of Eastern mysticism in the 60s and 70s. But Paul ended up with the Christian church. And the reason he said was, it's a similar message, but at least here I get a community. There's a building I can go to. We do some singing. There are some mechanisms in place through which I can demonstrate charity and I can help other people. We all gather together and acknowledge that we are fallen and we are flawed and we are broken, and we look to a higher power to acknowledge that and to give us the nod, a bit of forgiveness and confession and so on. And I think there's an enormous amount of sense in that. Most of the world's great religions, not all perhaps, but most of the world's great religions offer you the same access to the same reflection, that you are flawed, you are small, you cower beneath the majesty of creation, and you come together once a week to just acknowledge it. I think that, as much as anything else, the actual physical communion of religion is what's been lost almost more, I would say, than the stern edicts of the morality that are within it. Just like coming together once a week and expressing gratitude as much as anything else.
Yeah, the community aspect's definitely been lost. This is why everyone says to me, Nick, you've got to go to church. I was talking to young Rory, who helps out on the podcast and appears on it as well, Zoomer Rory, and he's a Zoomer, and he says, oh, no, I don't know. He has started going to church again now, but for a while he was saying he hates it. And a lot of younger people were saying, oh, I hate church, but I'm a Christian, because the church has become so wet. But you do need that aspect. Yeah, Paul only surprised me that he became a Catholic, because his background would have been Protestant, same as me. But he became a Catholic. That was the only surprise there. But then again, and he's certainly a good Christian, but he would be a great person anyway. He's like the best person.
Exactly.
Anyway.
It was a really natural fit, and he is a very naturally Christian man. He always seeks to connect, to bridge, to understand. So it was a very, very easy fit. He has
millions of friends, and he's the most always looks out for everyone.
And he's a great
better
comedian,
person than me. A great comedian as well.
Yeah. He does genuinely love the audience. He loves, acting for them and giving them some joy. I do think a lot of people go to Catholic Church now because they do, as you say, find the Church of England has just become so wet and so unsure of its own messages and does seem to have become somewhat captured. I don't know whether the Catholic Church is going to survive for very much longer either. And obviously they had a horrific scandal, but...
yeah. Welby's out there praising Ramadan. He just did it again. There was another photo of him doing Diwali, whatever it is. I don't know what they're called. But he was out. He did a whole message praising Muslims in their diversity. And we don't know what that meant. But bizarre stuff. Nothing about Christianity. Do you think, because I've just reread Submission, the second time Welbeck's going to write about it. Do you think that it could happen, the Islamic takeover? Because I noticed the message on the concourse at King's Cross with the hadith, and apparently they've now said they're going to take it down because it got such a backlash. But that's really, I noted that at least in Submission they won an election. It's a fictitious account of Islamic takeover. We've not even had an election here. They're just sticking the stuff up because these are little signs he notes in Submission. He says, "Oh, the women are wearing trousers suddenly, and certain shops have closed down." And one of them might have been, "Oh, there's a message at the train station." That feels like it's already happened. It's so strange. Even if you forget about white people are Christians and us being a Christian country, what about all the other religions? It must feel weird. Like, why did they get their message on the King's Cross thing? Madness.
Well, I mean, I don't know very much about it, but the conflict between Hinduism and Islam, of course, is very much still in play in one of the world's two great powers, arguably, at the moment. And that's not something we hear about very much in this country. I do think that I haven't read the book, but I have some understanding of the premise, which is that Welbeck's main character in that is a slightly sort of sexually dysfunctional, jaded old academic who actually finds that Islam is rather to his taste. It reinstates the patriarchy, and that he's actually, well, there's a lot to be said for that.
Opportunistically, it works out. It's an almost comically, deliberately sort of idealized version. Everything goes like once it comes in, everything goes well. They get money from Saudi Arabia. They're going to build a new Roman Empire. The men get 3 wives. Spoiler alert there, but you should definitely read it anyway. It's so good.
I wish somebody like Martin Amis had written the English equivalent of that, but I don't suppose we'll get it now. I mean, it is worth remembering that France has its own very particular history. Firstly, that obviously the Catholic Church was very much more important there until recently than the Church had been, really, I think, in England since the war. And also, Algeria, obviously it's a slightly different calculation for them about what they are embracing and adapting to, and have been for some time in that regard. So I don't know. But I mean, I can see it happening, I'm afraid. I can see, not the exact plot of Submission, obviously, but I can see Islam becoming a powerful force in the United Kingdom and across Western Europe in a way that at the moment is is not, people are more focused on terrorist outrages, murders, and school teachers in hiding, and specific instances of a very inflamed sort of aspect of it, rather than the deeper underlying, the slow creep, the blasphemy legislation in all but name coming in through hate speech and so on. Yeah, it's an extraordinarily powerful, effective, and proven conquest manifesto, the Quran. It works, and it's been working quietly on a number of less economically developed nations around the world for the last, in my lifetime. And I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
What can you say?
One crazy fact is, even if you respect religions and respect that tradition and that culture, and you say it's got lots of good aspects, it is the one where if we say something on headline, you're slightly thinking, will I be killed? You know what I mean? There's only one that works like that. And the fact that exists is so crazy, even if you say we're paranoid, but it's so crazy, and there's some evidence that we're not. That's just such a strange thing to think about. And everyone's the same. There's just one where we're all going, okay, will I get a death threat or worse? And there's only one that applies to.
Never had any at all, for what it's worth, myself.
There's a feeling.
I made one disobliging comment about Islam off the cuff in a live stand-up show at Edinburgh in 2022, and I cannot remember genuinely the sequence of events, but I think I was halfway through saying it was an ad lib, and it wasn't horrific by any means. And as I did so, I caught the eye of the one Muslim man in the audience with his wife, who was dressed in conservative but not full burqa or anything, and he looked like slightly hunted, like I'd picked him out, and he was upset, and I kind of tried to communicate with my eyes that, sorry Matt, that didn't mean but not in fear, but it had seemed possibly a bit unnecessary. Anyway, he sent me an email afterwards saying that he was disappointed in me because he had admired me as a comedian for ages, and my email address is on my website, so people can do that. And he had felt kind of picked on, and I sent him back quite a long email explaining that I had actually registered what was happening at the time, and I regretted it, but it wasn't meant badly, and I normally wouldn't say that, but perhaps there was the imp of the perverse had grasped the opportunity. And then he wrote me back another email going, well, I'm so pleased you've written to me, and I'm really reassured, and actually that's really kind of you, and thank you for taking the time. And we ended up almost having a sort of online hug, at the end of it, and I felt reassured. There are still, I mean, maybe we will find a way of accommodating exactly. But there's another part of me thinking, God knows how many other things I've said in the past, that nobody has felt they were in a position to even request. He wasn't overly assertive or anything. It was all fine.
Yeah.
But I remember saying 15 years ago, I can't remember if I said it on stage, but I had it in my head. The construct was, if as a comedian you had to name 3 things you would think twice about making jokes about, what would the other 2 be?
Genius.
Yeah,
That's brilliant.
that was it was only a joke for other comedians, really.
That's so funny. But you know what? It's some of these things fall more into the category, and I'm not being a cuck here, but some of these things it's perfectly possible to have respect for Islam as a religion and be interested in it and so on. And Welbeck actually has a character make a great case for it at the end of the book in this extraordinary monologue. But he's trying to make the case for it and be very fair. But there's the thing with Rotherham and all those things that falls more in the category of, you could argue, speaking out against the abuses and the neglect by our elite and by our authorities. When you talk about the police didn't investigate this, well, we talk about things all the time. Some of them involve Muslims, some of them don't, but they're all in the category of, why are you not addressing this point? And we must tell the truth about it. So they're not necessarily based on attacking Islam, are they? They're based much more on, this has been suppressed, this is a narco-tyranny, or all these things we talk about. One day we're talking about the police and the Palestine protests. Another day we're talking about a completely different topic of anything that's the obvious truth and obvious thing you should do being suppressed because of political correctness. I'll always be against.
Absolutely, yeah, and yes, you're right. I mean, our righteous indignation should be addressed towards the authorities that steered away from that. But obviously what you're dealing with a lot of the time is what amounts to human capital. How do people behave in groups? How do people who have received instructions about how to maintain community relations being at least as significant a consideration when determining, whether to pursue a certain claim or whatever as just keeping the streets safe. And how bright, frankly, are some of these people? How capable are they of making that call? And then also, to be brutally honest, Islam itself is not to blame at all for the grooming. Well, not at all. There's an element within Islam, if you want to read it in a certain way, that might seem to justify the grooming gang behavior to certain of its adherents. But primarily what you have there, again, is a group of people who came from, not just an Islamic culture or nation, but quite a backward culture and nation. They were even within the context of Pakistan. They were probably from the northwest frontier or whatever. Up in the Peshawar way, where there is quite a different understanding of what Islam wants society to look like from what you would find in Islamabad or Karachi.
Yeah, I've
so
it's
you can't just these things are not simple by any means, and we need, I think, as everyone now understands, we need to be vastly more concerned about the kind of people who are entering the country in huge numbers and finding refuge within existing enclaves where they are not forced to update their value system to that of a modern liberal democracy.
I know it comes down to immigration, and Bowden had an interesting point on that as well. He said he admired Islam, but he said they have their part of the world and they should keep it. He says it's about 1/6 of the world they have, and they should have that part, and we can have this part. And that was his case, that it's alien to the Western mind, which he felt was more reflexive and more not equivocal, but sort of coming in the sort of Greco-Roman tradition. We analyze, we look at things. Do we think that? Yeah, I think we do, but we interrogate it. Islam far more absolutist, and he just said it can't conquer the Western mind. Therefore, but he said we can be conquered externally just by weakness. If you're weak, someone can come in and stick a boot on your neck. I mean, which, by the way, could easily happen. But he's saying, but we can't be conquered internally at ideas level. I thought that was quite interesting. That we can't be conquered. I mean, it's a big idea, but maybe.
Rome, obviously, the Roman Empire is the one everyone goes back to, which was this, according to Gibbon, was defeated by Christianity, by those ideas, which were sort of emasculating, essentially. It had been a very masculine regime. That would be certainly Gibbon's historical reading. That was really what the anti-Semitism of 19th century German philosophy amounted to, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and so on. Not really anti-Semitic in the way that would be understood up by the Nazis, but just that Christianity itself was a watered-down version of a slave morality, which had been developed by the Jews in order to justify cope, essentially, in the modern terminology. But it had been denatured and then integrated and assimilated within the sort of Greco-Roman tradition, and that was, those two things together were a powerful alloy, essentially, a certain kind of Christianity connected with a certain kind of Greco-Roman philosophy or whatever, and that arguably is what created America. That's why Washington is this kind of slightly odd, even just aesthetically, there's a kind of, it's a Christian country. I mean, but there's the separation of church and state, but at the same time there's a powerful Christian ethos, but also a lot of their Washingtonian monuments and so on are based on things like the Parthenon. And so there's a kind of, there's a synthesis there, which is very powerful, and obviously, yes, Christianity has continued to reform itself. But as he says, that's quite separate from Islam, which says it is by its very nature, the very definition of totalitarianism. Everything you need is, throw away the library, burn the library, because everything you need to know is in this one book.
Yeah, Bowden called it illiberalism as a religion, which that's the irony, of course, is that it's going to be the worst for all the lefty wokesters. We're going to get wives; they're all going to be stuff. So it's actually going to.
But this is human nature. You're absolutely right. This kind of weird alliance, gays for Palestine and so on. But at the same time, this is exactly what the CIA have done with Islam as well. The CIA have introduced Wahhabism into Afghanistan in order to defeat the Soviet occupation. People always think they can use Islam against their enemies.
Be careful with that one. Yeah. That's a dangerous game. CIA, what are they on? What are they up to? I'm not sure about those lot. They seem to be behind almost everything when you look into it. Academic Agent talks about that. There's a whole book about tracing the CIA's involvement in all sorts of things you didn't realize they were in. So there's a whole theme there.
Probably like a lot of books like that, but yeah.
Do you have time, Simon, for a question about woke?
Yeah.
Because I want to ask you about, because Academic Agent said he's got this big theory, they're going to put the woke away, so the regime will take away the more egregious trappings of wokeness, particularly around race and things like that, and they'll go back to Fresh Prince, which is his shorthand for 90s colorblind liberalism. He has a bet with Oren McIntyre who says, no, they're true believers. They can't possibly go back, even if they wanted to. That's the bet. But even in AA's formulation, we'll still have immigration problems. We'll have all the deep fundamental problems, but there'll be a sort of superficial putting away of the more absurd aspects of woke, such as critical race theory, DEI, etc. But then we see this FT thing breaking today as we record. Might be a bit old by the time this comes out, hopefully not. And this is this absurd woke guidance for the Financial Times. They were having all these courses behind the scenes. James Esses has exposed it, and all sorts of things. One of them was there was a campaign that teaches staff how to be an active ally. As an example, if someone dared to wear a sombrero to a fancy dress party, they're instructed to say afterwards, "I'm sorry for wearing a sombrero. In the future, I'll be more mindful of cultural appropriation." Then there's another one where you're supposed to say, don't brush off your mistake, but also don't over-apologize. Over-apologizing can look like, I'm so sorry, I really wasn't raised like that. I can't believe I said that. Although often well-intentioned, apologies such as these can place the burden on the offended person to comfort their offender, adding to the offended person's emotional burden. So essentially, apologize for wearing a sombrero, but not too much. And that's one of like loads of examples from this study, from this guidance that the FT have been following. It's so obscene and woke and insane. And you know the kind of thing by now, nothing new. But that's a point against Academic Agent, maybe because that's the woke's still there. DEI is not going without a struggle. So which way do you see it going?
Well, I suppose I might not have quite as clear an idea of what is meant by the regime. Obviously, I can sort of understand it, in conversation, but who exactly it is and what might control it and how conscious it is. This is always the big question, isn't it? How conscious is it? How many memos are going around, because we in our world don't get them. But I'm not at all surprised to find that has been in place at the FT for some time. I know people have been saying for a long time now that the FT has been utterly captured and quite unexpectedly, obviously, given that you would think it was the house rag for raw capitalism, red in tooth and claw, but it certainly isn't that by any means. I had a look at the one of the videos that they have been circulated and instructed to watch. A woman called Verna Myers giving a TED talk. It was 10 years ago. She begins with the shooting of Ferguson, of Michael Brown. So this is thrown quite a long way back. I don't know how long the thing has been in place. In a way, that description of an apology, on the one hand, you might say, yes, that is obviously going to put, that is just almost seems designed to create tension and anxiety in anybody who knows they must apologize, but not too much. On the other hand, if you were to grow up in a society, most children are taught to apologize, but don't overdo it. At school, if you push another boy over in the playground, you're told to apologize, but you don't. You don't go too far because it's seen as sort of awkward and weird. Most people have an instinct about what's the appropriate level of contrition to demonstrate. So it's some of these things just seem weird because they're seen in print. But I think ultimately, I think
far worse example than
woke has come. Yeah, I think woke has come pretty much to its full form now. We know what we're dealing with. I can't see that there's any new demands emerging lately. It's just a sort of reiteration of the craziness, and it's becoming increasingly shrill. People like Chris Rufo in America have made substantial, regained legitimate pushback, rather than just online hectoring and complaining, such as the intellectual dark web we're indulging in, he's actually got some things into statute and so on. So I think it might fall away. I think it might decline. And like a lot of things, a bit like net zero, these things can be discussed endlessly when they're just hypotheticals. It's when you actually start feeling the sharp edge of the economic consequences that people start going, well, hang on a minute, yes, of course, I don't want the planet to overheat, but you telling me an extra 50 quid a month on my heating? Whoa. So I think that same sort of thing might start happening as people actually start losing their jobs or feeling promotions are sort of going, where they shouldn't be and so on. I think there will be some natural instinctive pushback, as it's starting to feed through. But whether the regime, as he puts it, is capable of making these adjustments, or whether it will simply be that, I think it's more likely to be woke capital has already probably had its day, and I think we've seen the peak Goldman Sachs Pride Parade kind of stuff, which is probably in a way more important than the SNP's illiberal legislation. I hope. I mean, that's my hope, because I think workplace culture and the I suppose the galvanized middle classes. I mean, as I think we said this, or maybe another conversation I was saying earlier, but I want to see J.K. Rowling arrested. Because that will wake a lot of people up. And I suspect she wants to see herself arrested as well. I think she's right up for it. I think she really wants to push it, and a few people like that. I want to see those cases, because it's extraordinary how many well-intentioned middle-class people, mums at school gates and so on, have assumed that this was just a question of being kind, for a long time. And it's not a question of being kind. It's a question of reasserting logos.
Absolutely. Yeah. And by the way, I just found one of the sillier examples from that FT guidance. There's also the privilege walk, where you had to take a step forward or backward depending on how many privilege points you had. There was also the sentence, people have put arbitrary ideas of gender onto genitals, and that penises are considered masculine gender markers. So it's all in there. They are considered that, aren't they? Those plumbing penises.
They are. Yeah.
Gender
people
markers.
Rush to that. Yeah.
So it's as absurd as you want. I just was starting on this shallow end for you, but yeah. Well, one other question then. Talking about the regime. I mean, elite theory pretty much posits that you have an elite. They do what they want. In fact, they don't even know why things happen, but they justify them in a post hoc way. Things just happen, then they just justify them later. Blair was a king at this. Loads of leaders have done this, or all of them in really an elite theory. Then you get a counter elite. If things get bad enough, you will get a counter elite displacing the elite, but you'll never get the will of the people. That's always a myth. But the part I'm struggling, I need to go back and reread, is that liberal democracies, so-called, although liberal and democracy are so often at odds, as we're finding more and more, they can't afford the democracy part, so they have to tone that down for the liberal part. We could cite many examples. But the one thing I'm struggling with and need to reread is how far, because liberal democracies rely on the illusion of consent, or they need to manufacture consent, they need that in a way that explicit authoritarian rulers don't. So they have to have a sort of mandate, an illusion of a mandate. That makes me think of Sunak, where it seems to me that he's struggled with that. He's never had the mandate. So when it comes to polling, will you vote for this guy? No. That's where it finally becomes a problem for the elite, because they've shoveled this guy in, wasn't voted for. The replacement was voted for by the members, Truss. Sunak wasn't voted for by either. And I think people have fundamentally never accepted that. Even though people have almost no power and we have an illusion of democracy, they do have the power to say, I won't vote for that guy at the next election. So I think he's in trouble for that reason. But I want to ask you about Sunak, but I also want to ask you a broader, more interesting question about this gulf between our elites at the moment and the people, which is we've noticed starkly everywhere. And how does Trump fit into this? Because he seems to be an example where the liberal hegemony has it failed? Because we see in Scotland, okay, oppressive hate crime laws, oppression in Canada. We see that we don't get to choose our leaders. We get these parachuted in people like Sunak. We see in Germany the AfD are sort of, no, we're not allowed them, cordon sanitaire and so on. Even Geert Wilders is not allowed to lead in Holland, whether that was party politics, I couldn't tell, or what it was. But we're not allowed these things. The far right goes to prison. You're at prison for stickers for 2 years. All sorts of thoughts are not allowed. Yet Trump seems to have sort of got through. The lawfare, they're attacking him so clearly in the same way, but he's getting through it. Is that by force of personality, or is it that the so-called regime can absorb Trump? He never really had sovereignty last time. He didn't get to enact anything he wanted. And actually, they've accepted Trump now. He's going to win. They won't rig it, and they'll allow Trump, but they'll kind of contain him. I know that's like 8 questions, but what do you think to any of that?
Well, I think, a few thoughts occurred to me. One is that the best way to understand liberal democracy, or democracy as we have it anyway, is not that we get to vote people in, but we get to vote them out. We get to reject them. That's the key mechanism which makes it work. It's a very. I always think of that famous quip of Churchill's that it's the worst possible system of government, except for all the others that have been tried. I think it's a great observation, and I think the key thing to remember is that that was not a vote in favor of it. He was genuinely saying government is like, all governments are horrible. They're all horrible failures. This is all terrible. And democracy, believe me, is far from perfect. But so far, nothing better has been tried, But that's the key virtue of democracy, that after 5 years of Sunak, even if the coup had taken place within weeks of Johnson's victory, there's a limit to how long he can stay there, and if he's bad enough, somebody will come along and turf him out. But who you get to put in is another question. I think that is, and yes, I felt bad with the Truss Kwarteng budget thing, which honestly, my life would have been so much better in the last couple of years if she was still in charge. Just on a purely selfish basis, I think I don't know where the British economy would be by comparison, but her notion about the level at which to place tax and to encourage enterprise and to encourage competitiveness and productivity rather than, just to absolutely batter the middle classes. I would have preferred that, and it does worry me that there was something very close to a coup really after that. I know the markets recoiled, angrily from what she did, but it's nothing that, it was no worse than the levels of unemployment that greeted Thatcher's revolution in '82. She was going to be out on her ear if it hadn't been for the Falklands War. Nobody would have moved in and gone, sorry, Maggie, but there's a national union of miners' strike, so we're having a coup. You don't do that. So anyway, that it's not as if Truss was voted for either. How has Trump short-circuited it? God, this is not a question to take on in the last 5 minutes of the podcast, but it is absolutely extraordinary. And my most powerful sense, like my visceral sense in watching him from 2016 to 2020, and I honestly didn't expect him to win on the day, and I was as shocked by anybody else, and to be honest, I hadn't even really investigated all the misrepresentations that had, greeted him on his way, and I was still willing to believe that he was all the things that CNN and MSNBC and so on had told me he was. But the visual sense you had was of almost like of an animal that has suddenly become aware that it has some kind of antibody, that it has some kind of parasite, or that it's got some, the deep state, for want of a better word, not with like necessarily in the full-blown conspiracy theory definition of that, but the existing civil service or whatever, they were just trying to kind of eliminate him. They were trying to vomit him up or get him out of their system so powerfully. It was extraordinary to see. I've never seen that in any other polity, in any other democracy. And then the fact that he was, that they, however stage managed or whatever was the degree of propaganda surrounding the way that the 6th of January, the invasion of the Capitol building, was presented, but the concerted effort to demonstrate that this man was absolutely Mussolini tier autodidact, this will be the end of American democracy, and he has still never been really meaningfully, plausibly challenged for the candidacy in the ensuing 4 years. I don't understand the mechanism by which he's pulled that off, but it's absolutely extraordinary, especially considering he had no political experience at all. He's not like a Lyndon B. Johnson, a serious player who calls in favors and bullies people in private meetings and plays one party off against another. He doesn't seem to have any of those kind of tricks at his disposal. He doesn't seem to have a playbook. People love to talk about that, but you have to assume that there is some kind of. I can understand why people would vote for him again. I get this. You sit on like the news quiz on Radio 4 or whatever. People go, "I can't believe they're going to go." Well, I say, well, I'm not saying he would be my candidate, but if you want to understand why people will vote for him again, I can give you half a dozen reasons for why. Under Barack Obama's second term. Putin invaded Crimea. Syria was an absolute catastrophe, and under Trump's first and so far only term, no new wars were opened. The $2 trillion catastrophe of Afghanistan was wound down. That finally, brought to a conclusion by Biden, but that was all in place. Under Trump, there were no new fronts opened. He made a couple of decisive strikes against key figures in Iran and so on that were entirely successful. His Middle East policy might have made some people feel anxious, but it seemed to work for as long as it lasted. Almost as soon as he's gone, Putin's back in the Ukraine, and everything's kicked off in the Middle East, and we're back into a disaster again. And if the only significant aspect of Trump's presidency is that he defies permanent war for permanent peace, that he defies the military-industrial complex, if that's the only thing that he does that other leaders haven't done, then that would arguably be enough to get my vote as well. Because that's the most significant thing a president brings to the table. In terms of the economy, they have bounced back very successfully. If you're willing to overlook $27 trillion of debt, they've absolutely nailed the post-COVID bounce back compared to most of Western Europe. But that really, most people's economic conditions are affected at the state level considerably more than they are by the White House. It's international policy and that matters. And on that front, as I say, he has broken that. He has broken that stranglehold that the hawks have had, that the neocons have had on foreign policy for a long time.
And that could be the reason that they reject him, like you say, like some sort of parasite or sort of tick or whatever you say. I mean, because if you believe the version of Kennedy, there's lots of versions of Kennedy. People might say this is an idealized version, but if you watch something like 13 Days, the movie, which is back on Amazon Prime, by the way, if you want to watch it, the feeling very much there is he's pressured by his military to go into a war, Cuban Missile Crisis, and it took absolutely everything to not go into this war. Then, lo and behold, what happens to him a couple of years later? So you look at Trump and you say, okay, they haven't killed him yet, but they've done everything they can to kill him in a metaphorical sense. So maybe it is just purely because he threatens the military-industrial complex. But he threatens everything, doesn't he? And as you say, when people complain about Trump, I go, just look at the empirical evidence. No wars, as you say, the economy better. And that's what's finally turning it around with Latino voters and black voters. They're just saying, look, the economy was better. And, of course, Iran didn't have all this money that Biden gave them. And it's just so annoying to watch all the things Biden's undone. But
I would also just say as well, this is the thing you get in this country as well, that legal immigrants are often the most vocal and most angry about illegal immigration because it tends to be their jobs, their salary, their bargaining power that is stripped away, and also their authenticity, if you like, their legality, their legitimacy as presence. People look at them and go, I wonder if that one, crept across the border or got his papers in order. And if you are somebody who's bothered to fill in the paperwork, that's infuriating. So they are quite easily become part of Trump's constituency as well.
There is an argument for a new elite. We talked about this with AA again. Sorry to keep referencing that, but it was a great podcast. But there could be this new elite with Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and it could involve Trump in some way, Tucker Carlson. There is a sort of potential for a sort of new 90s lib elite. You've got Trump back, you've got Tucker with his massive platform, you've got Elon Musk, massive power. They seem to sort of, and it's pretty pro-Israel. You've seen Musk hanging out with Ben Shapiro, and Trump's very pro-Israel. So it's a kind of Zionist, Bitcoin, pro-skilled immigration elite. I don't know what it is. It's kind of you can see maybe this is why Trump will be allowed. But depending on how conspiratorial you want to get, maybe they've accepted. All right, we'll bring Trump back in, and we'll have a kind of centrist thing going on again. And
well, it will be. I mean, I don't think there will ever be again that sort of sense of of glorious wreckage, last day of school kind of vibe that some people felt in 2016. And I'm not claiming I was sort of part of that. It was glorious banter, but it was worrying at the same time. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. Very different landscape now, and you're right. I think we still underestimate the importance of Musk taking over Twitter. I think there's a huge difference on Twitter now, and Twitter remains like it maybe lost some of its vitality, but it's still an incredible place for dispersing ideas, and it's vastly more tolerant of dissident viewpoints now than it was. I think Musk was absolutely right. It had been totally captured by really quite hard left sensibilities in Silicon Valley. Thiel, as you say, is a very interesting character. I wouldn't really have immediately thought of him as somebody who was part of that new movement, but he could be. He's a very smart guy. I've heard him speak a few times, and interestingly, also to me, he's a great proponent of René Girard and his mimetic desire theory that he studied under at Stanford, I think. That's where I first heard that name, and I found him very interesting and worth reading about. And that's his understanding of the world. It is quite philosophical, Thiel. So he's a smart guy as well. Yeah, Tucker is a different thing again. Tucker is really quite an old school. He's like a Norman Rockwell painting or something. Really, Tucker. He's quite a sweet, sentimental old guy. But and he believes in a few wacko things about UFOs and stuff. But there's a connection there, so you can get from Musk through Tucker to Joe Rogan's, who remains, an enormous force in American broadcasting. The command he has over an audience compared to CNN and stuff now is remarkable. So, there is. I don't know whether I call these people an elite, but they are certainly having an influence on the conversation. How much they can influence policy is another question. I don't know, but I think it's healthy that such a thing exists, and it didn't really exist in 2016.
Yeah. All right. Well, you've got to go. Very interesting answer again. Very interesting podcast. But you've got to go soon. I've got to go to work at Blummin GB News. I know I've said Blummin. Like I'm going to get myself in trouble. But very briefly at the end, then, just to see if we can both get sacked in the last 5 minutes. Do you have any thoughts on GB, the future of it, and that recent Ofcom? I believe it was yesterday as we record. Ofcom issued another attack on GB News, basically saying, whatever you want to call it, a ruling saying that that 5 programs were not impartial because, of course, Ofcom has the access to the metaphysical standard of impartiality, and they were talking about Jacob Rees-Mogg and Esther and Phil and all these shows, and GB hit back pretty strongly because it was if they're not allowed politicians on GB, then it's going to be a bit of an issue. I don't know. Any thoughts on, because some people are quite bullish about GB. I mean, the backers, I've heard podcasts with someone from Legatum. He was very confident about GB. Certainly, it's doing very well. Other people are, will it survive on the Starmer? There's a big question. What do you think?
Well, I mean, 2 slightly different issues. The Ofcom thing, I think I approve of the way they challenged it. Said you're moving the goalposts, this will have a chilling effect. But probably technically speaking, Ofcom with its own regulations sort of had a point. It's hostile to GB News, but it is also, I think, it recognises that it there are people like Russ Bridger and Oliver Cam on Twitter saying it must remove its license now. This is a disgrace, and I think it's holding a line fairly well in that regard. The subtle difference between having sitting MPs presenting discussion shows, which they're fine with, and which obviously LBC and so on have done as well, and having sitting MPs delivering news content, which is a slightly different issue, which, listen, I'm not an expert in that, so I think GB News can adapt and adjust to the ruling and take the steps necessary. I think it's doing tremendously well. Yeah, I think it probably has benefited from a couple of sort of surgical operations in the last couple of years. It demands more legitimacy as a result. I think incredible strides it's made, shouldered, as I put in an article, which hopefully will be in the Critic in the next couple of days, shouldered Talk TV into the ditch. I mean, I remember driving into work along the A40, seeing Piers Morgan 50 foot high on an illuminated billboard saying, Talk TV is coming. And I was like, oh, well, it's been fun. But, Murdoch money and this, his record of forcing his way into a market, this, I wonder whether we'll survive. Well, we not only survived, we absolutely trounced them. It's fantastic. We were humiliated them, and now they're on YouTube. And I am, again, not a businessman. I obviously, at some point, it would be nice to see the channel break even. There may be some aspects to that I'm not privy to that are making more sense than they appear to be on the balance sheet. But as long as Mr. Marshall and Nagata and so on are willing to bankroll it, I think its figures on its own terms, if it wasn't hindered and hampered by what I regard, frankly, as despicable campaigns to, warn advertisers off. And, it's proving to be a huge success, and I'm certainly unambiguously very proud of the content we've provided on the last 2.5 years. Their Headliners, I think, is a really good show, and I'm still surprised at how many people from across all classes and ethnicities and all the rest of it come up to me, literally after gigs, or lean across tables on the train, halfway to Manchester or whatever, and just go, good work, well done, keep it up, enjoying that, really like it. Usually just like, oh, it's a good laugh, like to wind down at the end of the day, or it gets me started in the morning. Never, none of them kind of looking around swivel-eyed, before it. Just really normal people enjoy that show and enjoy that we have that we chew the fat of the day's news with a degree of humour and brevity and pack it up and send it off. I'm very pleased with it. I hesitated briefly before getting involved because obviously I was getting in there while Andrew Neil's vacated seat was still warm, and thinking, am I going to have a rough ride here? But it's been overwhelmingly positive, and I think it's a great channel, and I really think it's going to continue to evolve and adapt and find its way to becoming commercially viable as well. But meanwhile, I think it's dominating the conversation compared to out of all proportion to its supposed size.
Yeah, who'd have thought Evans destroying Morgan, and as you say, we knocked them all the way back onto the dark web. I mean, we really destroyed them. They took one hell of a beating. No one saw that coming. And to be fair to GB and Angelo and everyone, they did get to market first, and they knew that was a massive thing, and we did beat them. And they were more American talk. They were trying to appeal to multiple markets, and they just didn't sit right with England. And GB is much more English and British. Yeah, and a couple of other things. The incisions you referred to. I still am on good terms with a lot of people who've left, but I understand. It's hard for me, that one, because I don't like to see people relentlessly attacking GB while I'm still there. But I also, still get on with the people. So it's tricky. GB can't be all things to all people. We're just trying to move the Overton window about an inch, I tend to think. And maybe one day I'll say something too controversial. But what else was I going to say? One more thing. I think you're a great asset to GB. People like you and Andrew Doyle, because it's hard for them to say we're stupid, because they think we're this ranty tabloid people. It's like, really, Simon Evans? Are you sure? You're smarter than Simon Evans and Andrew Doyle? So I think we should be as intellectual as possible and as artistic as possible. And
I agree. And for what it's worth, Andrew, so many people have said, Andrew's Free Speech Nation is like great TV by any standards, let alone to be tucked away on a channel that far down the listing on the. But he is. You're absolutely right. A great asset to them, and the quality he's maintained and sustained on that program is remarkable, really.
Yeah.
I think of him as their Tucker, really. But yeah. I think, for what it's worth, I suspect Piers Morgan will be back. I suspect there will be a. He is a pretty canny player, and I wouldn't necessarily regard Talk TV's demise as the end of Morgan, but you're right. The flavour of GB News it's just cuts through, doesn't it? It's cleaner, I think. There's just a sense of it being fresh, like a cold glass of water, really. And the way its enemies try and portray it as being defined by hate or bigotry or exaggeration. That just isn't the vibe I get from it at all.
No, I'd like a bit more hate, to be honest. It's I see it as I know we're neutral and regulated by Ofcom. I see it as a left liberal channel with some woke elements, and we put like Novara Media on, but we don't put Carl Benjamin on. So I'm like, okay, it's a left, and it lets occasional people slip through the net, like maybe me, but it's I see it like that. But it's the Overton window so far left. It's a left liberal channel, really. I know they dispute and say it's just it's a new channel. It is Ofcom regulated, so it has to be neutral. So we do our very best. But I'm saying neutral in this culture still means bias to the left, because just look at who you have on. You can have a literal communist on, but you can't have the opposite, of course. So all right. So that's GB, and I'm getting cocky, but all these people from Talk TV will probably come over and get my job. So there's always that chance. So we've got to be very careful. Anything could happen in this crazy game. All right. Oh, yeah, by the way, the people that come and speak to me as well are very much the salt of the earth. Man in a high-vis jacket came up to me in Sainsbury's saying he liked Headliners, and these are the people. So it's good that you've had that experience as
Absolutely, that experience, and really quite regularly, yeah. And some sort of, successful businessman in a camel hair coat, and also, as you say, people in high vis, and harassed mother or whatever. There's just a lot of people who enjoy that show, a really wide spectrum, and I'm sure the rest of the channel too.
I'm a bit gutted you've had it more regularly than me. I've had it like a couple of times. Oxford Street and Sainsbury's. I'm thinking, is it because of where I live? Is it because you're the host?
It's because I'm touring. They come up after tour shows as well.
That's what it is. Good. I knew there was a reason. I thought maybe they think Nick's shy. Or he's a bit of a loner. All right. Well, where can people find you at the moment, Simon, on the old internet and so on?
Well, the place to always go to for my tours is it's called thesimonevans.com. That's my website, and that's also the name of my Twitter account at @thesimonevans. Those are the main 2 points of access, and any important news will be coming out there. I am hoping at some point to start a Substack. I don't know whether that will in the next week or so. I've had a chat with them. I know everyone has got one now, but I think it'll be good discipline anyway, even if it's not a huge money spinner. But in the meantime, I think that's probably those two things cover most of it. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
And obviously, I would love people to come to the tour show, but it's not a politically it's not a ranty, topical tour show. It's quite reflective and mellow and nostalgic, and it's more sort of human life.
What's it about this time? Is it about?
It's called Have We Met, and it's a sense of. I don't know, of journeys going out and coming home again, a sense that I've had of being sort of having come back home after 25 years of touring, and children on the verge of leaving, and transitioning to thinking, is it time for the slippers and pipe, or
Oh, right. I thought you said your children were transitioning for a second there. I was like,
me transitioning, because a lot of my material over the last 10 years has been the sort of beleaguered dad thing. But it's funny how you sometimes don't notice, while you're still like working that seam, they've gone. And it's a quite open sort of discussion, I suppose, really, of how you deal with aging, how having to interrogate yourself to see whether you are demonstrating prejudice that just comes with age, or whether things have deteriorated catastrophically, that sort of thing. But I'm making it sound quite sort of dry and almost melancholy. I hope it's very funny, but it's quite personal anyway, I suppose. Yeah, it's personal.
Okay. All right, we go and find Simon Evans, go to his tour show and his forthcoming Substack when it's out. If you want to go to my Substack, it's now nickdixon.net, which is a custom domain Substack, very fancy. So nickdixon.net, it's $5 a month for my articles and all that sort of thing. Or buymeacoffee.com/nickdixon if you want to do a one-off donation, help the podcast keep going, and I'll reply to your comments. Buymeacoffee.com/nickdixon or nickdixon.net. And thanks again, Simon, for doing the show.
Absolute pleasure. Do you actually buy a coffee with any of that money?
No, because I don't drink coffee. But I was buying Coke Zero, but I quit for Lent. So I don't know, it's just all going on hookers and blow.
You can't rebrand it, can you? Buy me a blowjob.
Great ending to the podcast. All right. See you, mate.
Cheers. Bye-bye.